Okay, welcome to our next session, Financing Transformable Change and Achieving the SDGs in Africa. Now, Africa as a continent has gone from a laggard to something of an economic powerhouse in the last couple of decades, but ensuring that it will be equitable and a pro-poor powerhouse remains a challenge. So how to achieve it? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? That's what we're going to be hearing about now. And I'd like to introduce our chair, Dr. Fatima Denton, who's the director of the Special Initiatives Division of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. She's a lead author of the IPCC and an expert in climate change, food security, gender, and governance. So I'm sure this will be a great session. I will hand now over to Dr. Denton.
Thank you, and welcome to this session, which is essentially about transformational change and achieving sustainable development in Africa. We're very privileged to have a very distinguished panel. These are all people who understand the business of transformation. This is their core business, it's what they do on a daily basis. And I guess there is enough energy here. This is the last session in the day, so there's enough energy in this panel that will fuel the debate, and hopefully we'll have a very rich, productive, and animated discussions after this. Just maybe 2 or 3 words, I guess, to frame the discussion. My first observation is I think most of us understand 2 words in this theme or in this title. These 2 words are sustainable development and transformation. They almost have a universal resonance. We all understand it. But I think it's how do we graduate from an understanding to actually an implementation so that we can actually see what is it that will drive sustainable development, what kind of financial architecture do we have that we can draw from, and how does this kind of development help us in ensuring that we don't leave anyone behind? How do we make it more inclusive? What is the quality of development that we aspire to? So I think this is a key part of the discussion. It's not so much about the theoretical side of sustainable development, but it's more about how do we enable it? How do we make it happen? The second observation also is that our development in Africa is very strongly correlated with the production of raw materials. But I think most of you would agree that the problem we have, it's not so much that production, but it's the way in which we manage the production of raw materials and the way in which we add value to this production. So I think that's also a very important part of the discussion. You know, how do we begin to add value to our production systems? We've all heard about Africa Rising, and I think this is a very important time, or very important times. We're all in this Africa Rising debate, but it's also very important for us to understand what underpins this rising. You know, how fragile is this growth, or how resilient is this growth? And what do we do to ensure that this growth is sustainable? How do we transition, for instance, to a green economy, and how do we allow that to happen? What infrastructure should we put in place that would enable this transition? And how do we do it to make sure, again, as I've said, that we're arriving at structural transformation, that we're taking all the productive sectors that are important to Africa's development, and we're doing this not in an abstract way, but in a demonstrable way that allows us to exploit our agribusiness, our energy resources, our water resources, and to take agriculture with us. There's no single industrialized nation that has developed and hasn't done so without agriculture. So we're obligated in many ways to ensure that our development is underpinned by agriculture that is a performing agriculture, that lifts people out of poverty. So without further ado, I would like to invite, or basically introduce our speakers. I perhaps would start off with Her Excellency, Madam Tumisimi, Rhoda Peace-Tumisimi is the Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture, the African Union Commission. I was just commenting to Madam Tumisimi actually 2 days ago because she's a great champion of all things agriculture, rural economy, sustainable development, climate change, and I've often wondered where she draws her energy from, both her intellectual and physical energy. Madam Tumisimi, without further ado, I would like to invite you to the podium, or perhaps you'd want to give your talk here. But perhaps if you could also help us and give us a bird's-eye perspective of what the African Union Commission is doing in this area of structural transformation and how this structural transformation can be financed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Denton. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Let me say that it's an honor and privilege to be here in New Delhi to take part in the ministerial session of the 15th Delhi Sustainable Development Summit. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, under the able leadership of Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, has, as you know, contributed significantly towards generating consensus on climate change as a reality. In the same vein, we value the Delhi Sustainable Development Summit as being timely and pertinent in the sense that it provides a platform to consolidate the ideas in the movement towards the desired success of the climate change within the SDGs, also to discuss other related processes and thinking through the difficult aspects, including but not limited to finance. For us in Africa, the picture is such that while the economies are growing, we are worried that if the world does not get united on a common front to fight climate change, that growth will be reversed. And indeed, we know that the gains will be eroded. Africa's predominant economic activity is agriculture. African agriculture is basically rain-fed. However, as I speak, the rains have reduced. Frequency of droughts have increased, and the effects of climate change are intensifying across the continent. As part of the global village, and in the build-up to the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio+20, African stakeholders, including our technical institutions like UNEP, like African Development Bank, like United Nations Economic Community, came together and highlighted important areas to be underlined at Rio+20, spanning the social, the economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Fortunately, quite a number of our concerns expressed in the African Consensus Statement were incorporated in the outcome document on the world we want. Currently, we are again engaged, but we are also anxious about the outcomes of the three different but interlinked processes. One, as you may be aware, next month in Sendai, Japan, we shall dedicate our collective efforts to a global framework of action on disaster risk reduction. Two, as you know, in September in New York, the Sustainable Development Goals process will reach its height, and this process, compared to the previous MDGs, has this time round been engaging globally in a bottom-up fashion. Africa has come up with a common position on the post-2015 development agenda. Besides, it's being an input into the global process. For us in Africa, it will define the Africa we want, and it is part of the African Union Agenda 2063, which has been adopted by our heads of state and government in a meeting which ended actually last month, at the end of last month in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Sadly, in December 2015 in Paris, as you know again, the 20th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP21, will also be considering concluding the global agreement on climate change in order to bridge the gap between the aggregate efforts of mitigation pledges and aggregate emission pathways consistent with having a likely change of holding global average temperature rise below 2 degrees to avoid the catastrophic events on the most vulnerable continent, that is Africa, and the most vulnerable people, the women and the children. The Common African Position on Sustainable Development Goals has among its priority areas the issue of finance and partnerships to mobilize domestic resources and innovative finance. On climate change, I'm happy to also inform this conference that Africa is united and will continue to speak with one voice in the global climate change negotiations through the African group of our negotiators with the guidance of the African Ministers of Conference on Environment under the political leadership of the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. The priority for Africa is adaptation and means of implementation. The African leaders have reaffirmed Africa's commitment to working with all parties to achieve a legally binding agreement in December this year in Paris. Having said that, I would like to point out that Africa recognizes the nexus between these processes and expects that the world will build common understanding and intensify joint efforts towards positive outcomes that will commit to reduction of greenhouse gases and increase financing for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and also coping with disasters, especially in developing countries, particularly those in Africa. We consider as critical the capitalization of the Green Climate Fund, also the provision of the means of implementation for adaptation, as well as the transfer of technologies and capacity building. As Dr. Pachuri said yesterday, climate disruption will also lead to social disruption. We hope that also the International Conference on Financing for Development in July at Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, will accord special attention to climate finance. That will be transformative in the sense of enabling the achievement of SDGs. As Africa engages in these global negotiation processes, it is also engaged in country-level and regional-level processes to implement programs and projects to adapt to climate change and increase resilience and reduce the vulnerability of households, communities, and nations. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, let me state that these frameworks on disaster risk reduction, SDGs, and climate change will further help to consolidate the achievements in the past millennium and also take into account emerging issues. This timing provides an unprecedented opportunity to set a clear path for international development for the next generation. These framework agreements should be seen as complementary, with opportunities for mutual benefits in areas such as resilience, economic development, climate adaptation, and low carbon development with new flows of finance. But also, as Professor earlier on this afternoon, Akim said, we expect the world not to focus on things which divide us, but focus on those things which bind us together. That is, we need to conclude an agreement on climate change come December. I thank you.
I'd like to now move on to His Excellency, Honourable Minister of Mauritius, Mr. Dayal.
Madam Chairperson, Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, or should I say good evening. Allow me at the outset to commend Dr. Pachori, Terry, for organizing this important and timely event on sustainable development and climate change, aimed at shaping global solutions in the highest interest of mankind. I am indeed deeply honored to address this august gathering and present our views on financing transformational change and achieving Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, in Africa, an issue which is so pertinent to the African continent and to small island developing states, SIDS, such as Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Following the call of the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, I quote, develop a new generation of sustainable development goals to pick up where the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, leave off and agree on the means to achieve them, unquote. The African Union, following a thorough consultation with its member states, adopted a common position on the post-2015 development agenda in 2014. The Common African Position for a post-2015 development agenda covers environmental sustainability, natural resources management, and risk management of natural disasters, finance and partnership, human-centered development, peace and security, science, technology and innovation, and structural economic transformation. We firmly believe that an all-inclusive development agenda needs to pay special attention to the sound management of natural resources, biodiversity, conservation, and proper mobilization of financial resources to attain these objectives. There is a dire need to give due consideration to sustainable production and consumption, as well as enhanced productivity and efficiency in all sectors of the economy. It is therefore of utmost importance for us to reorient and redesign our policies and strategies for development that is all-inclusive and sustainable. Madam Chairperson, the financial cost of achieving development in Africa amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. This can only be financed from a mix of sources ranging from official development assistance, foreign direct investment, as well as an enhanced domestic resource mobilization process. Achieving the SDGs for Africa will only be possible if the financing support is adequate, predictable, sustainable, and transparent. We embrace the position of like-minded countries, including India, for the transfer of technology and financial support. Only in Africa, with transformative socio-economic development, will be able to avoid the unattainable initiative development in a resource-constrained world. There must be a paradigm shift in the relationship between the African states and the international community. The relationship between Africa and the international community must undergo transform change. which is rooted in the principle of equity of nations, mutual collaboration for mutual interests, and respect for the ability and right of Africans to lead their own change. We have brought a number of institutional changes and financial incentives to ease making business in Mauritius, while enhancing the protection and management of our resources. Sustainable development is now the key locomotive to enhance socio-economic development in an environmentally friendly manner. Mauritius has also learnt to value its most precious resources, which is the human resource. We are convinced that the human capacity is the most important element to gear our country towards a future that is prosperous for all, where economic success will be equally characterized by equity, ethics, and social justice. However, we are also aware that our hard-earned development can be jeopardized by external and natural factors which are beyond our control. It is known that climate change is one of the greatest challenges faced by mankind and will impact disproportionately on the poor and most vulnerable countries. Climate change is not an issue that will affect only future generations. It is taking its toll already today in an alarming manner. Recently, Mauritius faced a superstorm, Bansi, where storm surges reach up to 50 feet in the general area of Saint-Brandon, Agaliga, and Rodrigues. Saint-Brandon was flooded up to 3 feet inland, which caused inhabitants to seek refuge on roofs of buildings, a new meteorological phenomenon coming from the South Pole. And this morning, and up to now, I am handling a situation where a foreign vessel was fishing in our coastal zone of Saint-Brandon, and which ran aground. And there was a risk for oil pollution. We are managing the situation well with our resilience and capacity building, thanks to friendly countries. But then we need what I call a strong initiative for a legal framework at regional and international level to deal with this type of situation. No continent will be struck as severely by the impacts of climate change as Africa and SIDS in general, due to its geographical situation and limited capacities to adapt. Now, how can Africa and SIDS make progress towards the next level of development when our survival is uncertain and our limited resources are being diverted towards managing the impacts of climate change? However, in a spirit of solidarity to save the planet from disastrous impacts of climate change, Africa and SIDS have committed important resources. We now need concrete actions from the industrialized and developed countries. At the dawn of the Paris 2015 summit, we need concrete and meaningful actions and forceful commitment from the developed countries. The deal must include the following elements. First, more ambitious actions for greenhouse gas reduction before and after 2020. Second, a central role for equity. Third, a strong legal framework and clear rules. Fourth, sustained and transparent access to public finance for adaptation and transition to a low-carbon economy. And fifth, clear links to the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. There is a need for reporting and verification, tools of finance, mobilize and receive for a clear definition of SDGs finance, and better identification of developing countries' needs. We must ensure that the 2015 agreement is capable of responding to the latest science and keeping us collectively on track to limit temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees centigrade objective. Let me conclude by saying that we are at a critical juncture and we must act with urgency. Without international solidarity and enhanced financial support, Africa and SIDS would not be able to meet the SDGs targets. I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to now call on the Honourable Minister Saviour Kasukuwere.
Let me say from the outset that Africa is a continent with a bright future. We are coming from a view of hopelessness to now lots of hope that Africa is rising. Africa is attending to some of the key issues to do with the health, fighting poverty, hunger in our society. But clearly, like the Commissioner, Madam Head of the African Commission on Agriculture has said, there are some challenges associated with water, agriculture. These are key in terms of uplifting Africa. And I want to say that we must, at the same time, safeguard the economic gains we have made to date. But in understanding and dealing with some of these issues, I would rather go straight to the heart of our problem. We've been discussing this year, COP21, again we sit down and talk about the possible support that must come to Africa as a country which itself, as a world, as a continent itself, which has suffered a lot over the years, the exploitation of air resources, and so forth. We need to address this holistically and say, how do we fund Africa's mitigation and adaptation programs? Without funding, I think Africa's contribution to the climate change debate will become just a hollow talk. We need to be more aggressive, and I want to put forward our proposal that for Africa to achieve the financial capacity, let's look at the current exploitation, raw materials being shipped from the African continent to the whole world. Let's agree on a levy that will allow for a fund to be set up, tangible, which can be used by the African continent to address the issues to do with poverty, the issues to do with agriculture, hunger, and so forth. For as long as the majority of our people live in circumstances that force them not to contribute to this very important debate, in other words or action, the debate that we're having will not succeed. I'm saying so that for as long as our people are not being supported to transform, to become people who become owners of their own means of production, to be in charge of their own destiny. Look at the exploitation in the gold sector, mining. Rivers are being turned into dangerous places today with mercury because of the inferior mining methods that are being used. And again, this is being done with the direct support of some of the developing or developed nations who want to extract cheap resources from Africa. Hence, our call is to say, let's have a levy on each and every raw material taken from Africa. Let's set up this fund, i.e. 10%, which comes back into this fund to help transform Africa. In so doing, we can start to seriously address issues of Africa's capacity in terms of adaptation and mitigation. Today, close to 90% of the GDP, sub-Saharan Africa, is linked to our natural capital, forests, that is timber, freshwater resources, minerals and biodiversity being taken out in their raw form. The report just published now by President Thabo Mbeki is instructive. It shows us the billions of dollars which Africa is losing. Yet as we talk about COP21 and going forward, we have not made progress. We would rather agree, and I'm appealing to all of us, let's debate this thing freely and carefully and say, we are losing 40 billion per annum. Can't we immediately start tapping and saying, let's have a levy, get that same amount of money back into the African Development Bank, into the coffers of the African Union, and use that to start changing and transforming the people of Africa. Without that, we will continue talking. A poor man can never be expected to stick to an agreement. You can't tell the people who are suffering now, stop your mining methods because you are creating problems for us from a climate point of view. They will say, Minister, what will I feed my children on? You want me to stop cutting down the trees because we must contribute to the climate debate? Where is the power? So Africa has got this very clear challenge that it must tackle. We need energy. We need to support the farmers. We need to ensure that we look after our forests. But I want to appeal to the international community and to us, this very important gathering, that let us not continue discussing the matter of climate change in that same view, politics as usual. Let's now start putting figures on the table. And the developed world must be sincere. They must come to the negotiating table, sincere in ensuring that the promises that they've made before are realized. If not, then the best way forward is for us to agree on a levy which looks at the current exploitation. This debate will continue and continue, but for as long as we do not cut to the chest and say, enough of the talking, let us now commit ourselves from a financial point of view and start looking at the adaptation mitigation, then Africa's contribution to this debate will become very difficult. I know that my contribution is provoking, and I'm sure it's important for us to provoke each other here and say the debates, the discussions will hopeful, yes, but are we really going to see the dollar on the table? Is Africa going to start attracting or getting these funds for us to change the status of our people, fighting poverty, improving agriculture, or we continue to see degradation? Thank you very much.
I now have the pleasure to invite Mr. Idrissa Balde.
Bonjour, Madame, Messieurs. Je vais avoir le courage sénégalais de parler devant un public à majorité anglophone, mais je ne pouvais pas, ce courage-là est motivé par le fait que je ne pouvais pas ne pas représenter le Sénégal à cette tribune où l'Afrique est interpellée sur les questions de développement, sur les questions de financement des objectifs de développement durable. Donc, je vais commencer par remercier les organisateurs, remercier toute l'assistance pour avoir convié le Sénégal, pour avoir convié le ministre Abdoulaye Balde à cette importante manifestation. Pour parler du sujet financer le changement transformationnel pour atteindre les objectifs de développement durable, nous pouvons partir d'un accord à la base. Tout le monde est d'accord qu'il faut financer le changement pour atteindre les objectifs de développement. Et donc l'objectif est l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable. Je me permets de simplifier ainsi les choses sans retracer les passages des OMD aux ODD et sans préciser davantage les résultats attendus parce que je m'adresse à des experts de la question. Le sujet ne retient que la seule option du financement pour atteindre le résultat. Est-ce à dire le seul moyen ou c'est seulement le moyen qui reste à mobiliser? Cette analyse du sujet de la concentration nous amène à retenir que deux axes majeurs dans notre intervention. Réaliser le changement transformationnel et respecter les engagements de financement des objectifs de développement durable. Sur le premier point, après avoir écouté les éminences, Madame la Présidente de la Commission africaine, nous nous limiterons notre vision à rappeler la vision commune en nous tous sur la nécessité de réaliser et de mettre en œuvre un programme transformateur de développement pour l'après 2015 et informer sur les stratégies ou processus de mise en œuvre de cette vision au Sénégal. Il était convenu par la communauté internationale d'œuvrer pour un développement inclusif en faveur des générations présentes et futures, eu égard aux défis multiples auxquels les populations font face, notamment en matière d'éducation, de santé, de lutte contre la pauvreté et l'extrême pauvreté et des changements climatiques. Dans cette perspective, le gouvernement du Sénégal, dans son document de référence de la politique économique, sociale et environnementale, qui est le plan Sénégal émergent, s'est résolument orienté vers le développement durable par la création de richesses et la transformation structurelle de son économie. L'application d'un programme transformateur de développement nécessite une mise en œuvre effective des grandes décisions sectorielles. En matière d'environnement, le Sénégal estime nécessaire d'intensifier les actions susceptibles de mieux préserver la nature. Cette volonté nationale a été exprimée dans une lettre de politique sectorielle du ministère de l'Environnement et du Développement durable. L'objectif est que la politique environnementale est d'assurer une gestion rationnelle de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles pour contribuer à la réduction de la pauvreté dans une perspective de développement durable. 3 objectifs sectoriels ont été déclinés à partir de l'objectif global. Dans un premier temps, il fallait améliorer la base des connaissances de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles. Ensuite, intensifier la lutte contre la tendance actuelle à la dégradation de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles dans le respect des conventions internationales. Et enfin, de renforcer les capacités institutionnelles et techniques des acteurs dans la mise en œuvre des actions de conservation de l'environnement et des ressources naturelles. En résumé, la démarche empruntée par cette lettre, cette politique donc, était de partir de la connaissance du secteur de l'environnement et du développement durable, d'en identifier le problème et de disposer de ressources humaines et moyens technologiques adéquats pour résoudre les problèmes. Il faut aussi indiquer que chaque objectif sectoriel est décliné en plusieurs axes d'intervention. Cette lettre, élaborée en application des dispositions des textes législatifs et réglementaires nationaux, est en phase avec toutes les conventions en matière d'environnement et de développement durable que le Sénégal a ratifiées. Il ne pouvait en être autrement, parce que dès après la conférence de Rio+20, le chef de l'État, M. Macky Sall, avait proposé à la communauté internationale d'adopter une nouvelle gouvernance verte articulée autour de politiques économiques et sociales équilibrées et adossées à des technologies et des modes de production écologiquement rationnels. C'est dans cette série de mesures en faveur du développement durable que M. le Président de la République a pris 2 mesures majeures en décidant de l'organisation chaque année d'une conférence nationale sur le développement durable et en proposant la région de Tambacounda comme prioritaire, comme le territoire d'expérimentation de la nouvelle dynamique et de sa consolidation. Le ministère de l'Environnement et du Développement durable s'active à l'organisation de la première conférence nationale sur le développement durable avant avril 2015. Cette conférence va procéder à la validation technique et politique de la stratégie nationale du développement durable. Dans cette lutte contre la pauvreté, avec le soutien des institutions internationales, l'année 2015 est une année de référence parce que constituant un point de départ vers cette fois-ci un monde meilleur, où les conditions de vie en termes économiques et sociaux seront meilleures. Après le préalable que constitue la réalisation du changement transformationnel, dans les 3 volets social, économique et environnemental de développement durable, le financement reste le pilier fondamental pour sa mise en œuvre. En nous exprimant ainsi, nous avons apporté la réponse à notre propre interrogation de départ. Le financement doit intervenir dans le processus d'atteinte des résultats et en tant qu'intrant, après la réalisation des changements qui, elle-même, est l'aboutissement d'un autre processus. La qualité des politiques est l'intrant principal. C'est elle qui suscite l'engagement du partenaire. C'est la prise de cet engagement qui entraîne son respect. Si les pays développés prévoient de continuer d'aider les pays en développement, notamment africains, avec les ODD au travers de l'appui de l'APD, il faut que ces derniers s'approprient le discours sur le développement et œuvrent dans ce sens. Ce qui implique pour les pays africains qu'en plus de l'assistance de la communauté internationale, il faudra fournir un gros effort. Cet effort aussi a besoin de financement. Cette observation pose la question, qu'est-ce qu'il y a à financer? Pour avoir des ressources humaines de qualité, pour avoir la technologie qu'il faut, les conditions de vie, de travail minimales, et même la nécessaire motivation des acteurs, il y a besoin de financement. C'est là où il faut situer l'effort des États. Cet effort, une fois validé par un engagement de financement extérieur, sous quelque forme qu'il soit négocié, doit être suivi d'une mise en œuvre effective pour récompenser et encourager les efforts des États et donner l'assurance d'atteindre les objectifs de développement durable. Il faut rappeler que les experts ont suffisamment décrit les lenteurs dans la prise de décision et leur exécution, les insuffisances de l'aide au développement, le non-respect des engagements pris en matière de financement est lourd de conséquences sur l'atteinte des objectifs. Mesdames, Messieurs, voilà ce que je voulais apporter comme contribution du Sénégal. Je vous remercie de votre aimable attention.
I think he started off his discussion by basically interrogating the theme, and he wondered whether finance is the most important element in terms of realizing sustainable development. And whether if we do tick the finance box, does that mean that we have actually achieved sustainable development? So that was one of his first points. He later went on to say that there are two issues to consider. The first one is how do you arrive at transformational change? And the second one is how do you respect the financial commitments that would underpin sustainable development goals? He also talked about how do you achieve, or at least posed the question about how do you achieve a post-2015 transformation. And he talked also about a plan that would more or less be aligned with Senegal's vision. How does the post-2015 transformation, how can this be aligned to Senegal's vision? He mentioned that the international community has an obligation to work towards inclusive development, and a development that does not just embrace present generation, but as well as future generations as well. And a development also that responds to multiple challenges that are ranging from poverty, health, education, etc. And he gave us an insight into a reference document in Senegal, which is a policy document that underpins Senegal's approach to sustainable development, which I think it's called Plan Senegal Emergent. So this document is strongly aligned to sustainable development, wealth creation, and structural transformation. He also underlined that transformational development can only be realized when key sectors or key sectoral decisions, I should say, are embedded in this transformation process. And he went on to say that Senegal's main rationale in the area of environment is very much geared towards resource efficiency and the efficient use of natural resources. And this, he said, is reflected in three sectoral objectives: to improve the knowledge base of the environment and natural resources, to redouble efforts in the fight to curb environmental degradation in line with the major international conventions, and to strengthen institutional and technical capacity in the implementation of action towards environmental conservation and natural resource management. He gave us a little bit of an insight, or rather a contextual history in terms of Rio+20. And he talked about the President Macky Sall and how he, I think, in the aftermath of Rio+20, has adopted a new green governance policy, I think, which is strongly rooted in ecological modes of production. And I think he used a town in Senegal, Tambacounda, to basically create space for the demonstration of this very notion of sustainable development. He also went on to say that 2015 is a reference point, and I think this is a point that was also very well made by the Commissioner, for which a new world that would also take into account social and economic conditions, and how these social and economic conditions could be made better for vulnerable communities. And he ended up by saying that finance is a key element of the way in which we implement sustainable development, and that finance is central to the way in which we deploy skilled human resources that will help us also access smart technologies and better working conditions. He deplored the slow pace of the negotiations and the slow progress vis-a-vis implementations and the inadequacies related to public aid. But he said that financial commitment is key, and the way in which this is respected may have serious consequences, respected or not, I guess, may have serious consequences for Africa. So I guess those are the key points, at least that I picked up from Mr. Balde's intervention. But just to sort of frame the discussion in terms of what follows, I think you've heard from all our speakers. There was a strong, at least, framing about the fact that Africa has actually traveled a long way, and that as part of our journey, we should try and ensure that we safeguard economic gains without reversing and returning back to the old trends of poverty, hopelessness, and privation. And I think those are still with us. The point was also made that finance is a central piece of the transformation that we seek. The structural transformation can be rooted in finance. But I think all of our speakers have said that finance is not the only lever that should design and regulate, if you like, the kind of transformation that we seek. The minister from Mauritius gave us some insights into this by basically talking about the importance of a fair and equitable treaty, one that has ambitious targets to emissions reductions. The Commissioner talked about the necessity for strong partnerships that are rooted in the desire of Africa to speak with one voice. And this is all enshrined with the common African position. We also heard about the fact that Africa's economic reality is still defined in the way in which we manage our natural resources and the quality of management related to our natural resources. Minister Kasukuwere gave us a lot of food for thought by talking about the more than $50 billion that Africa loses in terms of illicit financial flow. And I think he defied the rest of us, or the international community for that matter, when he referred to the necessity, or at least a proposal that he made, of a 10% levy on raw materials, which he thinks that once we have this 10% levy on the raw materials that we produce, or the exports of these raw materials, that amounts of money, or those amounts of money could also help in terms of financing effective adaptation and mitigation. So I would now like to open the floor to questions. Well, let's say questions. I'm sure we'll get a lot of commentary, but it'd be really great if we could hear some pointed questions based on what you've heard from our distinguished panelists. So I'll pause for a minute and then take some questions. I have a gentleman in the middle there. If you could just tell us quickly who you are and then the question and who it's directed to.
Good evening. Actually, I am from South, Chennai. We actually developing as our sustainable commitment barren land development. As everyone told, to investment for agriculture. We are a group of industry are ready to invest in couple of millions or thousands of acre development of sustainable agriculture in Africa. The question is, how to take the land either by lease or outright purchase, and the security for our investment. There may be any United Nations or somebody will sign the contract, because previous stories are not good. And as Madam Tusmi said that most of the land are rain-fed, and what will be the possibility of getting, there may be source of groundwater or canal water. Don't mind, we will put our own dam or micro-irrigation. And for in India, instance, for agriculture, we are getting it to 40% subsidy from the government. So any kind of subsidy is available by the local government or from the international agencies.
Any other questions, perhaps?
First of all, thank you all of you for your enlightening views. My question is for Honorable Jayeshwur Dayal. Sir, you talked about the need for a paradigm shift between the relations of Africa and the world. Can you please elaborate on this point a little?
As it stands, India is not doing very well with protecting our wild animals. And Africa is a great continent with wild animals still there, and they are also being threatened, I understand. But what particular steps the African Union might be taking to make sure that the biodiversity that is still there in Africa, and I suggest it is probably the largest biodiversity in the world, in any other continents, that is maintained and preserved.
So we've got three questions. Perhaps we can start with Honourable Minister. You had a very specific question on the paradigm shift and whether you could elaborate on that. So if we could take that answer first.
The specific is very specific in that as things are, it's one-sided. So it has to be two-sided. At least that's a minimum baseline. And if you want things to be done, it has to be in partnership with equity, understanding the needs of those who are vulnerable. And we are talking about the destiny of humanity as far as climate change is concerned. So therefore, it's a major threat that has to be tackled with major resources, finance, transfer of technology. Unless and until we don't merge our hearts and minds in the same direction, the objective will be unattainable. This is my firm view, and I'm sure if we do it, the future will be there for us and for generations to come.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I can throw this question to you, Minister Kasukuwere, about how do you enable a business environment that will promote sustainable agriculture? At least that's what I understood from that question.
Well, I think I want to agree with my colleague that once we adopt an inclusive approach, an inclusive strategy that is equity, that society at large feels it's a fair deal, you are more likely to make more progress. But the moment inequality exists, you then cannot guarantee certainty in society. Hence, for us to create that environment, the point that my colleague has raised, the minister from Mauritius, is very pertinent. Let's have an inclusive strategy that will allow that both the developed and the developing share in this growth trajectory. The moment we are happy or we allow a situation where those who are already burdened remain with the burden, there is no shared ownership, there is no shared responsibility, then we will not make any progress.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Balde, est-ce que vous aurez quelque chose à ajouter par rapport à ce qui a été dit, surtout sur la notion du développement, enfin d'une agriculture durable? Comment maintenir une agriculture durable? Quel est l'environnement qui doit nous aider pour aller vers cette agriculture durable?
Bon, en fait, je crois que si vous avez remarqué depuis le début, je ne parle que de ce que le Sénégal est en train de faire. Parce qu'en fait, c'est vrai, nous sommes dans la solidarité africaine, mais il vaut mieux parler des choses que nous connaissons. En matière d'agriculture, je vous ai parlé tout à l'heure du plan Sénégal émergent. Nous avons dit aujourd'hui que l'agriculture doit nous aider à arriver au Sénégal à une autosuffisance alimentaire. Et aujourd'hui, l'agrobusiness occupe une place importante dans ce programme que nous sommes en train de développer au Sénégal. Également, donc je disais que l'agrobusiness occupe une place importante dans ce programme-là. Et notre président de la République vient de finir une mission sur l'ensemble du Sénégal du Nord pour voir aujourd'hui quelles sont les potentialités que le Sénégal avait en agriculture. Et là, il a révélé, avec des techniciens, qu'en fait, on peut arriver à l'autosuffisance alimentaire. Et aujourd'hui, le partenariat public-privé est un acteur et un moyen aujourd'hui pour que nous puissions arriver à développer ce secteur-là et arriver aux objectifs que nous voulons en termes de développement. Et c'est la première phase d'ailleurs du plan Sénégal émergent. Maintenant, il faut effectivement compter sur nous-mêmes et compter sur l'extérieur. Et c'est pour ça que le plan Sénégal émergent constitue aujourd'hui une plateforme incontournable parce qu'elle a été validée à la fois par les acteurs nationaux et internationaux et des sources de financement sont disponibles pour arriver à financer l'agriculture durable au Sénégal.
Thank you. So Mr. Balde was talking about the Plan Senegal Émergent, which is this policy that enshrines the way in which Senegal would be able to arrive at sustainable development. And he also talked about just how important agribusiness is in this in Senegalese economy. And he also talked about the importance again of food sufficiency. And how important it is that they should also rely on themselves as well as relying on the international community. He said that the Plan Senegal Émergent has been validated by both national and international stakeholders. And I guess this is the plan that they're using to be able to design a lot of the concrete actions that they're doing vis-à-vis agriculture. Madam Tunisimi, I was wondering whether you could react to the question on... What was the first question?
On investment in agriculture.
Wildlife.
Oh, okay. So then we haven't answered the first question, have we?
No.
Okay. Maybe you could tell us what the first question is, because I missed that part.
The first question was, we have somebody from the south of India who is very much interested in investment in the agricultural sector.
Yeah.
What are the guarantees and what are the subsidies? I know for one that there are plenty of opportunities in Africa, but let's hear it from the chair.
He's putting the chair on the spot. No, I didn't quite get the question. Is the question about incentives or is it about...
incentives, subsidy for investment in Africa,
Incentives.
in agricultural sector?
Okay, perhaps Madam Tumisini, if you could respond to that question about investment and incentives from the AU perspective, or AUC, what are you actually doing?
Well, the question which was raised within the limitation of time, I know it is quite late. I would like to say that there are opportunities in Africa for investing in agriculture. And for example, about 60% of the land in Africa is still available. But the issue which he raised about the subsidies and incentives, I think when you are going to invest, you don't start from subsidy point of view. And each country has got its own rules and regulation. But at the continental level, we have a land policy initiative, which the members of Africa signed to. So they guide the investment opportunities in Africa. And I would like to say that Africa welcomes foreign direct investment. But then the issue which he has raised on sustainable development is priority for us. We must ensure that whatever agriculture we do is done sustainably. And there are rules and processes at the country level, especially with the national environmental management authorities, which we have, all countries have got that. So the negotiations have to be between the investor and also the country itself. But most of the countries have got a lot of incentives, tax incentives, they have facilitation, one-stop center for investment. So all those are available. It's the entry point which should be the country itself.
Thank you. Madam Tumisini, would you also like to take the question on the biodiversity issue about how you preserve a culture of biodiversity, what we're doing to protect our wild animals in Africa?
Well, I'm sure you know that biodiversity is important and is valued by Africa. But unfortunately, there has been a situation, and I think that is why somebody who asked also, he has already left the room. He didn't, oh, I can see he's talking, yes. That is why there is a lot of really outcry about poaching of livestock, and it is a concern. The issue of flora, conservation of flora and fauna is so critical and very important. It needs a global community because there is international interest, there is local interest, but we have to ensure that we fight it together. And in fact, quite soon also the continent is going to come together and put in place strategies and mechanisms to ensure that we protect our biodiversity. We value it so much.
Thank you very much.
Let me just add.
Yes, Minister.
Yeah, I might just add on the very important question raised to do with African wildlife and what the AU is doing. But at the country level, for instance, Zimbabwe, we consider our biodiversity very, very seriously and as an important part of our economic development. For instance, tourism. For us to sustain tourism, we need to ensure that these animals are valuable, they are looked after, conservation is done, and more importantly, communities adjacent or communities living within areas where we have our biodiversity must start benefiting. As Zimbabwe, we have run a successful program, the Campfire program, that sees communities participating in looking after the biodiversity and benefiting out of the process. But what tends to happen again, unfortunately, is unnecessary interference, whereas you find measures are taken against given countries which affect the culture, established culture, i.e. around the Campfire programs. And these tend to distort benefits accruing to Africa. Let me say that all of us in Africa, it is our responsibility to look after this God-given resource. And each and every government that we interact with has spared no effort, no little effort in looking after the biodiversity that we have. So this is very important for all of us in Africa. It creates employment, it's part of our tourism, it's part of what sustains our communities. And so we must press ahead and look after this important biodiversity.
I'm Ananya Dasgupta from All India Women's Conference. It's an NGO. I just want to say that since the youth are the torchbearers of future we want, why can't we with Africa have some cultural exchange programs with the youth and the students?
At the African Union level and India, we have a lot of collaboration and interaction since you come from India. We even have, at the heads of state level, the cooperation is so high. At the training level, education, the cooperation is very high. And also on cultural, socio-economic, the cooperation is very high. So there is an exchange program. In fact, we have young volunteers. They come to India to learn from the countries in Africa, to learn on how the educational system is like, to learn on to be attached to institutions. In that way, there's cross-fertilization of understanding of cultures and also appreciation of the different values of different societies. So there is.
At the level of Mauritius, we have a very positive interaction with students. Many Mauritian students, they come through a special program of interaction with their counterparts in India, and it's vice versa. It's working fantastically well.
The climate funding has emerged as an important area of concern. One of the eminent panelists, the Zimbabwean minister also raised this question. And before this, the former Guyanese president also raised the question of climate funding. And the honorable panelists also suggested that, a 10% levy on raw materials can be done, which is a good idea. But unless, there is a global support for this kind of thing, a 10% levy for one particular area could be a disadvantage, because when the raw material goes outside the country, it will become incompetent. But since it is for a good cause, it is for a global cause, do you think there is a need for a global framework, or maybe the UN can be roped in, because this is something which is going to help everyone, and maybe a viable solution? Otherwise, these kind of talks or summit, they'll be just mere talks, which would be, at the end of the day, deliver nothing. Like DSDS is happening in Delhi for the past 15 years. And as a matter of fact, Delhi still remains one of the most polluted countries of the world. So the message fails to, just crawl behind these walls. So do you think we can have something of a global framework where such noble ideas, where people are taking initiatives, but they need some global support?
Don't you think that Africa has a lot of similarity to large parts of India, leaving aside a few very prosperous areas? And we could learn a lot from the African experience on how to deal with inequities, how you dealt it, because a lot of things are very similar. But somehow, I suppose, there's a fallacy that we don't want to take your experiences. The thin attendance here reflects the same, I suppose. But I just wanted to know from the panelists, what is all that India could take from the experiences of specific your countries?
Minister Kasukuwere, I think that question about the 10% levy is really geared towards you. Would it gain traction? Can you retell the idea to the international community, and why should they buy into it?
Thank you very much. I'm happy that I found support, and I think this is where we start. It's necessary for us to be practical. And why I raised this issue of the levy is because whilst we talk about the continuing talks after talks, right now there is damage being caused to the environment. As we continue to extract resources, like I said, 60–70% of the GDP in Africa is financed out of natural resource extraction, raw materials. I think I don't see how the world can refuse such a clear and straightforward proposal, which will help all of us to start doing something practical in dealing with the adaptation and mitigation. Because if we continue talking, we've been in Kyoto, Mexico, and so forth, and now we'll be talking about Paris. The negotiators have been at it for the past 21 years, and there's not even $21 million which has come out of these negotiations. In other words, not even $1 million. Yet, on a daily basis in Africa, the damage to the environment continues. And the people in Africa, in terms of poverty, continue to recede. In other words, they are now becoming more and more poorer. Yet we want to see everyone, the African community, the communities that we have, the women, the girl child, and so forth, participate. But they can only do that if the finances, which each and every one of the speakers here have spoken about, we need to see on the table financing for us to positively start impacting on climate change. So I think we must sell this message to the world, and I think this is the beginning, and I have no doubt that the UN must come in from a technical point of view and say, guys, how do we do it? So that at least effectively we start making that part and parcel of a sustainable program that will help us achieve the objectives that we have all set in terms of climate change.
Thank you very much. We've also had a question which was, I guess, about South-South partnership. And I think the point here is that the situation in Africa and in Asia are not radically dissimilar. So how do we create space for South-South partnership? The Commissioner was talking about cross-fertilization. How do we enable that beyond just the rhetorical talk about South-South partnership? Minister. I'm looking towards you.
With your smile, I think, we're all convinced that with goodwill, a lot of things can happen. I was talking about the smile of the chairperson, and I started thinking about goodwill. With goodwill, a lot of things can happen. And in partnership, this is very important. I would say it's vital. So the framework do exist. I think there is a need for human factor engineering in terms of those who have got leadership role to guide through this type of collaborative effort as far as diplomacy is concerned and as far as relationship is concerned. It is in the interest of everyone to get going. And once we get going, I think the sky is the limit. So we have to move forward with this goodwill that something can be done in terms of South-South partnership. There is scope for it. We just have to take the lead. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a very rich discussion. We've examined and cross-examined this whole discussion on finance. We've looked at it from its different contours. And we've talked about transformation and how we can achieve transformation. And I think you've also pointed to a lot of signposts from now to Paris that would enable us to at least leap towards this transformation. So I would like to really thank all our panelists, our distinguished panelists, for your innovative ideas, for your determination to take Africa forward and to ensure that Africa is central to this debate. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your stamina and your energies and your patience, especially for having given us the question that has allowed our speakers to elaborate further on their very rich issues and points that they have debated today. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for staying the course. Thank you.